This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast with you this week for a conversation on Palm Sunday, the sixth week of Lent. And before we get to that, though, just as a reminder, last week during the fifth week, Derek and Brittany explored Matthew chapter 27, verses 22 through 31, and Mark chapter 15, verses 37 through 41, looking at Jesus before Pilate, how the soldiers treated Jesus, and Jesus' last breath. Together, they discussed how the love that Jesus has for his Father is the foundation for his obedience that results in love for all those around him. Extending this conversation into our own lives, Derek and Brittany helped us realize that as important as it is for us to love those around us, this love first comes out of obedience rooted in love for Jesus. This week, we move into week 6, as I said, and we're going to be looking at a number of different passages. I'm just going to list them out because like I said, there's a number of them. There's Luke chapter 22, verses 33 through 34, Luke chapter 23, verses 39 through 43, John chapter 19, verses 25 through 27, Matthew chapter 27, verses 45 through 46, John chapter 19, verses 28 through 30, and Luke chapter 23, verses 44 through 46. And even though there's a lot of these specific passages are related to Jesus' last words. And so this is a common thing that is talked about during the Lent season, specifically in oftentimes on Good Friday services. But our series in My Cup Runneth Over has been basically taking Holy Week, just as a reminder, taking Holy Week and spreading it out over the entire season of Lent. And so this week for our Palm Sunday conversation, we are using these passages, which represent the final sayings of Jesus, as our conversation point, as the scripture for what we talked about on Sunday morning and what we're now following up with on Wednesday here. And so I'm going to be reading for us today. So I'm just going to jump right in and then we'll see where we go from there. So first we have Luke chapter 23, verse 33 through 34. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Luke chapter 23, verses 39 through 43. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." John chapter 19, verses 25 through 27. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Matthew 27, verses 45 through 46. From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" John chapter 19, verses 28 through 30. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it up to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Luke chapter 23, verses 44 through 46. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. So these are the passages that we are going to be working with today. And so with that, what are we seeing as we work through these?
So I think it makes sense to kind of begin with the first of these statements. So this is Luke 23, 33 through 34. And so this is Jesus' statement about forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And this, I think, is one of those things that's easier said than done in practice. It's something we all know that we're supposed to forgive our enemies. We know this in our heart. We know this to be true. But yet, when it comes into practice, we can think of 1,000 excuses, usually for, why they don't deserve our forgiveness, or why we're justified in harboring the resentment. And at the kids' table, we spent a little bit of time talking about this and talking about how, there's people in our lives that do wrong us, that are cruel to us or unkind. And it was kind of put this way: if we are not excited about the potential of seeing our enemies in heaven someday, then we don't have the heart of Jesus. And I think when you think about that as a broad overarching theme, you're okay with it. But then when you start to contemplate, okay, who is the enemy?
Right.
And you have a name, especially when you're in the midst of a particular situation, and then you place them there and say, well, would I be envious? Would I be frustrated if I saw them in heaven too? And I think that is, we consider that to be a good test of our heart, a good heart test, because if we're going to have the heart of Jesus, then we want to be able to say, man, I'm so glad they're here, right? Because Father, forgive them. They didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, man, that's really good. A really good conversation that you guys had at the kids' table. As I was looking at this, it's not necessarily directly in line with it, but I read this statement from Jesus of, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." And the thing that gets my attention is immediately after that, we read, "And they divided up his clothes by casting lots." Like, these people who had been the ones who wronged, Jesus says, "I forgive you," or Jesus says, "Father, forgive them." And they're like, yeah, whatever. And they just go on with what they were doing.
I think that is quite remarkable. And it shows that there's forgiveness. Jesus, his first instinct is forgiveness, even toward ignorance. And I think we are often quick to say, well, I'd forgive them if they'd say sorry. Well, they didn't say sorry. And there's no repentance. And so we're not willing to offer forgiveness without them being willing to say, I've done something wrong. But Jesus, he's extending this forgiveness even though
he went ahead of it.
Yeah. Even though, or asked for forgiveness on their behalf, even though they
persisted in their ignorance.
As you said, could have cared less. And I think that's an excellent model. And, as we talk through each of these statements, we can recognize these statements as being like kind of these last 7 things, the most important things really, that sum up Jesus and his kingdom.
Mm.
and what he's inviting us into. And if we're going to follow after him, then the radical love that we extend to others should look like this.
Mm.
Forgiveness of people who are ignorant of how they've wronged us.
And so, like in this first saying, we have Jesus, um, asking his Father to forgive essentially his enemy, right? Like these are external people who are intending him harm. Yes, maybe they're persisting in the ignorance of the wrong that they have done, but I don't think it's a stretch for us to say these are enemies of
Yes.
Jesus. And so in this first statement, Jesus extends forgiveness to his enemies, even though they weren't seeking it. And then we move into the second statement, the second conversation, and once again, Jesus's focus is turned outward, is turned towards those next to him. And so now he's looking at the criminals. Now it's this conversation between the two that are hanging on either side of him.
I think it's, as we move into this statement, it's a good thing that you've pointed out this turning outwards.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, I mean, he very well, anybody would have probably hung there and said, woe is me.
Or not even woe is me, but just experiencing that terrible pain. Like, how can you think about anything else than what you're enduring?
But he's so focused, like you said, he's so focused on the other, which he had to be willing to be there.
Mm.
And because that was his motivation for obedience, right? He wanted to please the Father, but the Father had him on mission, and he was obedient because he saw the Father's vision and agreed to obey.
Right. Which that was part of the conversation that Derek and Brittany had last week about this idea that like the love that Jesus had for others was a love that was first rooted in his love for his Father. And so his love for his Father at the root resulted in obedience in his life, which produced the fruit of love for those around him.
And here you see that being played out in Jesus's final moments on the cross.
Right.
And as you mentioned also in this second statement, there's this willingness to extend the forgiveness to this criminal who comes in at the last minute and says, Jesus, me too. And I think this paints a really clear picture of Jesus's kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen this modeled throughout his ministry, right? Like whether it's the woman at the well, whether it's him healing the sick, coming in contact with the untouchables, him just being present and available to the lowest of the low and seeing them in this moment. This is a criminal. This is somebody who doesn't deserve his mercy or grace or forgiveness. And yet Jesus says, oh no, you're good to go. And Jesus is in fact told parables about this, right? Like he said, even the people who come in at the very end, like
doesn't matter.
They didn't follow the rituals or the laws of the Pharisees. And yet Jesus is welcoming this criminal with open arms. And it's a model for what we as Christians should be doing as we work to grow his kingdom, is recognizing no one is unsavable.
Yeah. And I think even beyond that, like I feel like there's a whole conversation that we could have here. And I don't know, maybe it's not necessarily the exact time, but at the same time, like I'm sitting here listening to this conversation. I'm watching what Jesus has done, thinking about this idea of like Jesus extending forgiveness to people who weren't even seeking it in the ignorance that they persisted in. And then Jesus extending forgiveness and the promise of paradise to somebody who has not been pursuing him whatsoever until this last moment when he identifies him as essentially as Lord, right? Because he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Like he has identified that Jesus is Lord, and that is it. He hasn't gone and saved 18 people. He hasn't been baptized. He hasn't taken communion. He has done nothing from a ritual perspective or from a religious expectation perspective other than make the proclamation that Jesus is Lord. And so I think that even like for us, it's important for us to see this. Like Nothing else is required for Jesus to say, "Today you will be with me in paradise," aside from this individual recognizing him as Lord. Period. That's it. There's no crazy hoops that he has to jump through. There's no specific like incantation he has to recite. There is no action to perform. It is simply this heart alignment with the reality of the lordship of Christ. And I think that with that, like this is something we need to remember. Again, this doesn't then excuse and say, well, all I have to do is say Jesus is Lord and then I don't have to do anything else, right? Like
this criminal, he really believes Jesus is Lord.
Right.
And he's ready to obey him.
Right.
It's just he's out of time.
And he's kind of stuck on a cross. Yeah. Like there's nothing he can do about that. Anyways, I think it's vital for us to understand that in this whole conversation of salvation, in this whole conversation of, what is going to happen in eternity, what we see in this saying from Jesus, as far as the expectation on our side of what our responsibility is, it's a responsibility to identify Jesus as Lord and like our life resonate with that reality. And so as we move on now into the John passage of Jesus saying, "Woman, here's your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother," we have just another instance. We've kind of had a couple of layers here. First, we had these enemies that Jesus was focused on and focused on like restoration, right? He was saying, "Forgive them." And then we have the criminals. So first, those that are outright hostile, then those that have no business belonging. So these are people on the margins that Jesus is focused on, even though he is the one also one hanging on a cross suffering. And now you move into this third saying of Jesus where he is once again focused on the other. This time, the other layer that he's focused on is his family, the loved ones that are close to him.
Yeah, I think this particular statement is such an important reminder because it reminds us that the cross is about more than just redemption. It's also about the reality that Jesus desires relationship. Mm-hmm. And he's here to facilitate relationship. And as he institutes the church by having these followers, these people who are going to be obedient to him, he's also instituting a relationship, a family. Mm-hmm. That is the church. And it really paints a beautiful picture of, I guess, the beginnings of this church family. Care for one another, right? You have this woman here who's lost her son. Yep. And now we talked in the kids group a little bit about what that would mean for Mary. We know in Jesus's ministry, there was a time when Jesus saw this very person, this woman. A situation. Yeah, an exact situation where a woman had lost her son and she was without. And now she has no ability to hold a job. She can't possess any land or property. So she has no way to really survive. Mm-hmm. And Jesus has compassion on her. Mm-hmm. And out of that compassion, heals her son, brings her son
back to life.
Yeah, resurrects her son.
Yep.
So, and in that moment, he not just brings this boy back to life or this man back to life, but now he's also reestablished this woman's security.
Yes.
And he's seen her. And I feel like this is the same seeing he does here with Mary, mm-hmm. when he looks at Mary and sees her in the same light and says, okay, I'm redefining your family. This church that's being born here, this is a family. Care for one another. And you see they go on to do just this. And this is only the beginning of those relationships that will be modeled. And we get to read all about that throughout Acts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, right. The immediately after Jesus says this to both of them, it says, from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. And the note that I made next to this as I was reading it and kind of contemplating it was new family, new responsibility. And so Jesus has established, like you said, this church family now, right? Like this is the institution of the family known as the church. And with the institution of the family, the familial reality, there also comes this responsibility to each other reality, where before the disciple whom Jesus loved did not have in a like direct sense, a responsibility to make sure that Mary was provided for. However, at this point, when he redefines what family is, now that very disciple does have a responsibility to make sure that Mary was provided for. And if we, again, kind of carry that into our, today time, to conversations for today, I feel like we have to recognize this still in existence, this idea that, Jesus has instituted the church family. And so when we come together and we're attending a church together, like attending a church is more than just showing up to a building on a Sunday morning. When you are a part of a church, you are a part of a family. And being a part of a family means that you have people that are there to care for you and watch out for you. But it also means that you are there to care for those around you and watch out for them. Like, church is so much more than just this simple transaction of like, I show up, I get filled up so that I can get through my week, or I show up and I get fed. Like, that is not church. I'm sorry. Church is so much more than that. It's a family. It's responsibility. It's relationship.
We talk a lot of times in the church about how there's this tendency to cheapen God's grace.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like in a lot of ways we've cheapened God's church.
Yeah, I agree.
Because we've traded this beautiful picture, as you've pointed out, of what Jesus had initially instituted. And we've traded that and exchanged it for something that feels cheap. It feels shallow and doesn't have the same commitment and responsibility and beauty that Jesus intended with the institution of the church, right? This family picture. And man, when I think about that, if the church could get on board with recognizing its members as family, it would transform the way the church operates.
Yep.
It would probably transform a lot of the issues that arise within the church and a lot of the disagreements if we could see one another as family. I don't know. Jesus knew what he was doing when he did this. I mean, and that's the thing with each of these statements. As we look at them, you're like, I know why he thought that this was one of the most important things that he should leave with us in his last, little teaching or sermon, as it were.
Yeah. So we have love and forgive your enemy, see the marginalized, care for your family. And then we move into something that's a little bit different now, where, Jesus makes this statement of, my God, why have you forsaken me?
This particular statement comes from Psalm 22. So Jesus is quoting from that particular psalm. And as he quotes, there's an inference that God isn't there, that God has turned his back on Jesus for this moment. And this makes me think back to a lot of the Old Testament instances where God's holy presence, it's so holy that sin and evil and anything unclean or impure, even good things that are not perfectly holy, are destroyed by God's presence. And Jesus, who has been walking this life of perfect obedience unto God, now stands in the gap. He takes on the sin of the world in this moment, and God's very presence, his holiness, would destroy it. And so God looks away, and Jesus in that moment feels the abandonment that was supposed to be ours. He feels God's distance that would have been ours. had Jesus not gone through with this and been obedient to it and bore our sin on our behalf. And that abandonment that he expresses, that feeling of forsakenness, it exposes just how much he loved us. He loves us because he was willing to have this separation from God that was ours. That's humanity's curse because of our disobedience, that we were to be separated from God. Not that someone who had done it right, not the new Adam who had been perfect, who had made every decision and done nothing wrong. Not that he would have to be separated from God, but that was supposed to be mine. But because he did this, because he went through this, I don't have to be separated from God anymore. And that abandonment that he felt is something I will never have to endure because his spirit is with me always. And I think that it just, again, it models this radical and incredible love that he who didn't deserve any of this endured all of this for me.
And, I think the crazy thing about it is for us, we're on this side of Jesus. And so Jesus has already accomplished this. This doesn't have to be redone over and over and over again so that we don't feel this abandonment. And yet I feel like so often when we are like walking in our own way, when we are not walking in obedience to God, we get this sense of maybe what could be abandonment or like a back being turned on us. But the truth of the matter is, I think that's more us than it is him. Like it's our own self-imposed expectation of abandonment more so than it is him actually leaving us, because he has already promised to never leave us or forsake us. He has gone to the cross to restore this relationship and to like keep that channel open for a relationship to exist. Like God has taken the step towards us. Even though we step away, he has stepped towards us. And so when we are walking in disobedience, when we are finding ourselves in a life of sin, even now, like God is not turning his back on us, but all too often I hear people talk about how, like God has abandoned me because, I'm in this tough situation. He's gone. He's not here. But more than anything, as I think about what you're talking about, Natasha, and what Jesus is saying here and what was accomplished here, like I think those are lies of the enemy that are in our head that are being like imposed from our side of the conversation and not his.
At the kids' table, we talked a little bit about this feeling of abandonment and that you're mentioning, and that sometimes, even though God hasn't abandoned us, life circumstances or his quiet voice maybe makes us feel abandoned in it. And we were discussing how even though that may not be the reality, the feeling is still real.
Yeah, that's fair.
And as that feeling is real, we can recognize Jesus literally was abandoned by God. He's literally forsaken for that moment. And so we can go to him and he knows exactly how we're feeling. Mm-hmm. And he understands and he's big enough to take it. And we can sit there and we can just let it all out and tell Jesus how we feel that he's abandoned us and how we feel that we can't hear him and we don't understand why and where is he and what's he doing. And he's big enough to handle those feelings. He's big enough to handle those frustrations and emotions. And in fact, he invites that kind of a relationship with us where we can dialogue about these things because he wants to be our comforter in the moment when he, that moment where he had none.
Mm-hmm. And so, Jesus feeling things that we feel as we move on into the fifth and sixth sayings of Jesus. We have this statement that he makes of, I am thirsty. A very human thing to say, right? Like when I think of eternity, I'm not thinking that being thirsty is going to be something that we have to struggle with anymore when everything is restored to God's intention. And so like I see this very human statement that Jesus is making again, I am thirsty. And around our table, we spent some time talking about this and people were asking about, is there any um, anything of significance here for him to be saying this, anything of significance in the fact that a jar of wine vinegar was offered, and the fact that it was put on a sponge, or that a stalk of hyssop was used. And there's a lot of different things, different pieces that we could definitely talk about with respect to this piece. But I think the thing that is probably most important from a symbolic perspective that we should talk about, knowing the next statement that comes, which is, "It is finished," is this idea that I am thirsty. And then the fact that this cup, this jar of wine vinegar is offered to him. There's a lot of conversation that this represents the fourth and final cup of the Passover meal. And so if you think back to the meal that Jesus shared with his disciples, we call it the Last Supper, right? We call it the thing that communion is based off of. But this was a Passover meal that he was sharing with his disciples. And a traditional Seder meal has 4 cups associated with it that you drink throughout the meal together at different times. There's the cup of sanctification, the cup of deliverance, the cup of redemption, and then the last one is the cup of praise, or the cup of completion. And even though in the gospel accounts it doesn't actually outline them taking different cups, it does talk about how at one point Jesus, stands up and he holds this cup and he says, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for you." The understanding is that Jesus has held up the third cup, the cup of redemption. That's what this cup represents. But then immediately after he shares this with his disciples, he also makes the statement that I will not drink from this again until the kingdom comes. And so essentially Jesus doesn't ever finish the Passover cups. They're incomplete. He ends on the third cup. And so we come to the cross, and here on the cross he makes the statement that I am thirsty, and this cup is offered to him. This cup of completion, this cup of promise. And this cup of completion, this cup of praise represents the fullness of God's promise to them, like that you are my people and I am your God. It's like this covenant that is being representative of the covenant that has been made of old. And so as Jesus is taking this cup, he is making this final statement of, like, this is my covenant to you. This is my promise. You are my people, and I am your God.
And I think this is such an important part of the conversation, because Jesus in this moment is redefining the Jewish Passover meal. He's taking something that is so essential to who they are, all the way back to God's promise with Abraham, and then, with Isaac and Jacob. And as he brings these people,
Moses out of Egypt,
as he brings Moses out of Egypt, he is this covenant, this new covenant is made with the people of Israel. And this is the fulfillment of that moment, and he doesn't want them to miss it. And so that's why it's so critical that they are in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival. That's right. What brought Jesus.
That's why they're here.
There. And so as Jesus is redefining these cups and what they mean, he's pointing. The Jewish people would have understood this so clearly, that this is the Messiah. If you had any doubts before, this is it. This is the fulfillment of the covenant, and it is finished. It is complete. And here is the new kingdom. We are living into the new kingdom.
Could you imagine what the people must have been thinking for them to know that, right? For them to understand what he is saying. And for him to say, it is finished, it is complete, the kingdom is here. But then the thing that they're seeing with their eyes is a man hanging on a cross. Like that is a very stark contrast to, I'd imagine, the expectation that they had for what it would look like for the kingdom to be here.
Absolutely. You contrast that to the Palm Sunday and the expectation
Yes.
that in walks the Messiah, or in rides the Messiah, the man who is going to overthrow the Roman government and finally free us from this political oppression and oversight. But he's freeing them from something so much bigger. They could
So
not
much
even
more
conceive.
oppressive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
could not even conceive of the captivity of sin that he would free humanity from.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy. And so now we kind of move into this final saying of Jesus of, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And I know, just this previous one, he makes a statement, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So these are two different gospels, essentially reporting on a very similar situation. And so we come to this final passage in Luke chapter 23, and Jesus makes a statement, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And there's a couple of different things that I really want to say about this. One of them is relating to this from about noon until there was darkness over the whole land until 3 p.m, which also goes back to the Matthew passage. And around our table, I mean, the question was like, why is there darkness over the whole land? What does this darkness represent? And as I had kind of looked into this, there was some interesting thoughts that I came across about this darkness. In addition to, like this being a representative of God turning his back on the sin that was present there. We just came off this conversation about the cups and what the cup represented and how deep that was in like the Jewish tradition. Well, another part of a typical Passover meal, like Passover originated at the Exodus, right? Like that's where Passover was instituted. And then Moses said, this is something we're supposed to do every year in remembrance of what God did and who we are. And the ninth plague that the Egyptians endured was the plague of darkness. And immediately following darkness, what happened? What was the next plague? Death of the firstborn. And here we have on the cross the one and only Son of God, the firstborn. And so it's almost like there is this symbolic, like redefining, as you've already said, of this deep-seated history and tradition of the Jews. And you have Jesus here on the cross with darkness coming over the whole land. Yes, symbolic of judgment. Yes, symbolic of mourning. Yes, symbolic of turning his back. But also this allusion to the Exodus and the darkness that falls just before the death of the firstborn, which is about to happen. And so just this idea that like in Jesus, we find the culmination of this salvation history that God has been working for millennia. And it's all happening right before their eyes. And it's undeniable. I mean, even the lights go out. Like you can't just say this person is a nobody, because even the cosmos are responding to what is happening at this particular point in history, at this particular place. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about also kind of goes back and pairs with the Matthew passage of, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's just, it holds these two statements together, right? So in Matthew, Jesus makes the statement of, why have you forsaken me? And as you already talked about, Natasha, like you have Jesus with this sense of abandonment, this sense that his Father is not here. But then as he dies, right, as he breathes his last, his statement is a statement of trust. He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. even in the midst of feeling betrayed, he still trusts his Father. And for me specifically, like that was just like heavy, because like this is the fight for faith that I feel like I am in the midst of right now, just in stuff that I'm going through, in the circumstances that are surrounding us. And the, I'm having some health issues, and it's been a long struggle. And I feel like I'm regularly like, what is going on? And yet Jesus has modeled here, like, I'm not hanging on a cross. I'm not enduring this level of suffering, this level of abandonment. And even though Jesus experienced it, he still has this trust and this dependence and this faith in his Father to be able to say, at the end of it all, I put myself in your hands. And I feel like Jesus just models for us a perfect response to these moments when we feel like we've been abandoned, or when we feel like we're going through this ringer and Jesus is nowhere to be found. Like, he's already modeled what it looks like for us to still continue to persist in our faith and our trust in him. Even when we may not sense it, even when we may not hear what he is saying or see where he is leading, we can still come to this place of heart resolve where we say, and yet, Jesus, I still trust you. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me, but I trust you. And for me, like, I needed to hear that. I needed to be reminded of that this week. And so I know we've covered a lot of ground, been in 3 different gospels, addressed different scenes of Jesus's crucifixion, talked about his 7 final sayings before his death. And with this, we see a painting of what the kingdom of heaven looks like as he interacts with others, or interacts on behalf of others. We see a glimpse of just how deep his love is for his creation. And ultimately, we see this perfect model of the level of trust and dependence that he has on his Father. This is a conversation that we've been having for a long time, even before Lent, but especially during Lent, right? Because we see and we know that Lent is a representative of the time that Jesus spent in the wilderness before he goes into ministry. And during this time in the wilderness, we talked about how it was an establishing of his dependence on his Father, right? Like, not that he needed to establish it, but it was a working out of that establishment of his dependence on his Father. And so it's no surprise that with his final word, Jesus puts the exclamation point on his dependence on his Father and his trust in his Father. And so as I think about our lives, as I think about maybe what Jesus might be challenging us to this week, first I think he might be challenging us to redefine our understanding of what the kingdom looks like. It's something we talked about on Sunday. It's Palm Sunday. It's supposed to be celebratory, supposed to be, Hosanna, everything all exciting. But that celebration was misplaced. That celebration was under the expectation of conquest. Conquest of the Roman Empire, conquest of the reigning powers, and a restoration to the empire of Jerusalem, of Israel. And so maybe Jesus wants to help redefine what his kingdom really looks like. Maybe we need to give him the permission to redefine what his kingdom really is. And then subsequent to that, as he redefines that, as he opens our eyes to what he is bringing in, maybe he's calling us to a deeper trust and a deeper dependence in him and on him. That even in our times when we feel like we are abandoned, when we feel like nobody is there, when we feel like Jesus has walked away, when we feel like we can't hear him any longer, he is inviting us into a deeper trust and expectation that he is still there. Because the truth that has been revealed to us on this Palm Sunday, as we work through his final sayings, is that in those moments, in those times when we feel like everybody has abandoned us, including him, he is there. He's been there. And he meets us there as well.
As you journey with us through this season of Lent, we recommend purchasing My Cup Runneth Over, a Lenten journey in Jerusalem, which is available for purchase both on Amazon and the Foundry Publishing website. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizano podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.